It's been quite a while since I gave another in my series on Galatians, but we'll try to finish it up. We just have one more chapter, and we'll be able to finish this book. If you want to listen to the rest of them, they're on my YouTube channel. It's just Wilbur Atwood is my channel, and you can look at the rest of them. It's interesting what Margarita decided to talk about in Sabbath school, because it tied in perfectly, and she didn't talk to me and I didn't talk to her, with what I'm going to share here. So we'll begin with verse 1. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Here is a recipe given by the Lord through Paul, how we can take care of any difficulties that arise in the church. Now it's interesting, there's several points here, and we're going to look at each one of them under the magnifying glass. In Gospel Workers, it defines, what does it mean when it says, ye which are spiritual? Ye which are spiritual, that is, you who have a connection with God. In other words, those that do not have a connection with God cannot do what this verse tells us to do. Only those that have a connection with God. They are able to restore such a one in the spirit of meekness. Do not crush all hope and courage out of the soul. Now, if we're not connected with God, when we try to straighten each other out, that's what we do. We crush all hope and courage, and the person has a terrible struggle, maybe even tempted to give up following the Lord because it wasn't carried out in the way that God intended for it to be done. Do not crush all hope and courage out of the soul, but restore him in meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. In other words, don't think that you couldn't fall on the same point that they fell on, but remember that in a couple of weeks, they may have to come and labor with you over the same issue that you labored with them. Faithful reproofs will be needed, and kindly counsel and supplications to God to bring him to see his sin and danger. Since we're all so weak, we know ahead of time that there are going to be mistakes made by church members, some of which we will see, some we won't, but the ones we see, this is the recipe how we can stay together in full love and unity together and not discourage anybody in the church over the correction that we are trying to give them. Next, we look at what is the meaning of the word overtaken. From Gospel Workers 397, here is a special direction to deal tenderly with those overtaken in a fault. This word overtaken must have its full significance. It describes something different from deliberate sin. It applies to one who is led into sin unawares, and notice what it was that leads them into sin. want of watchfulness and prayer, not discerning the temptation of Satan, and so falling into his snare. Now, if you read about Moses when he struck the rock, that was the problem. He did not see that as a temptation. Afterward, he woke up and he saw what he had done, but in the beginning, he didn't realize. And so this is the kind of mistake that is called being overtaken. And these kind of sins happen with converted people. They take place on a regular basis. And so it's very important that we handle those very, as it says here, tenderly and with meekness, as our text tells us. However, there are people, and I don't know of any in this church, but there are people that sin on purpose. It says there is a difference to be made in the case of one who deliberately enters into temptation, who marks out an evil course, covering his sin skillfully, that he may not be detected. This is what is experienced during times of persecution, when people turn you into the government, but they don't tell you that they're turning you in to the government. They just call up and they secretly pass on the information. My neighbor is doing such and such that they're not supposed to do. And you get in trouble. You have no idea why you got in trouble. But that kind of sin is different from the one that this text is talking about. This is about the kind of mistakes that converted people make because they weren't watching enough and praying enough. They didn't realize that Satan was tempting them, and so they did something or said something and fell. Now, unfortunately, the church doesn't do real well. Not talking about this church particularly, but we're all in danger. Every church is in danger. And from the Southern Watchman of September 29, 1908, we read, "There is a great lack of deep, earnest, soul-touching sympathy for the tempted and the erring. Our natural tendency is to condemn them. Our natural tendency is to talk about them that hurts their reputation. That's our natural tendency to do that. But those things show that we don't have the deep, earnest, soul-touching sympathy for the tempted and erring. The way God wants us to be is to say, oh, what can I do to help this person get over this mistake that they made and go on successfully in their Christian walk? That should be our first, response if we're really connected with God. Many pass by on the other side, keeping as far as possible from those who most need help. So a lot of people, they just don't do anything. They don't speak to them. They don't pray with them. They don't try to get them over the problem. They just pass by on the other side, like the Pharisee and the publican. Or not the publican, the priest. Sometimes the newly converted or weak soul yields to some form of temptation and is overtaken in a fault. In such cases, the instructions of God's Word apply. I've had people say, as they were being studied with to join the Adventist Church, that they felt really loved. They really felt that everyone wanted them to become a part of them. But once they were baptized, it was very different. Now as it says here, some member sees them doing something that's not right, and they get treated in a very different manner. But this is warning us, don't do that. You just might drive that new believer out of the church by doing that. And so we need to do it God's way. Fifth Testimonies 2:46 says, we know but little of our own hearts, and have but little sense of our own need of the mercy of God. We have a tendency to be blinded to our own mistakes, our own sins, and yet be able to see other people's sins really well. And that's why it warns us that we really need to treat people good, because we have things wrong with us as well that we may not see, and we might need them to come and help us at some point. This is why we cherish so little of that sweet compassion which Jesus manifests toward us, and which we should manifest toward one another. Aren't we thankful that Jesus treats us good even when we're bad? You know, one of the things that I've noticed in my life is when I would make a mistake, it seems like the Lord goes out of the way to show me that He still loves me. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only one that gets that. I'm sure that He treats everybody that way. And so simply what He's asking us to do is to treat other people like He's treating us. We should remember that our brethren are weak, erring mortals like ourselves. Unfortunately, often we have an expectation of perfection in others that is just not realistic. And then if they let us down, why, that really bothers us. But if we change our expectations and realize everybody's weak, everybody's going to fall, we know that will stop at the close of probation, but we're not there yet. So in the meantime, it's going to happen, and God is helping us to know how we are to handle it. Review and Herald of May 7, 1895. It is very hard for those who err to see their faults. So the less we're kind to others probably means that we're not seeing our own weakness and our own sins very well. Many are blind to the faults in themselves, which are plainly discerned by others. And I've noticed this too, that those who are the most tender-hearted, in other words, if somebody goes to them and points out some wrong that they've done, the person that did the pointing out, somebody could come to them, but if they did, they wouldn't take it very well, because they're so tender-hearted for themselves, but not for the other person. So it needs to get reversed to where we welcome anybody to come to us and help us to see some mistake that we made, or at least if we already see it, to pray with us over it. And yet, when we work with others, to be so kind and tender about it and do our best not to hurt them in any way, even though we feel called to bring up what was done. In a letter, 28, written in 1888, if you were in greater light than they were, if you were in connection with God, why, I ask you, did you not try to save your brethren? In other words, if you could see what they did wasn't a good thing, Why didn't you do something about it? Why didn't you try to help them so that they could recover from this mistake? Then the word restore is a very good word. And in the book Education, page 113, it says the word here translated restore means to put in joint as a dislocated bone. We're all thankful if we break an arm, or I broke a part, it was pretty close to the wrist a few years ago, but we're pretty happy when they put it back in place, right? What a blessing it is. How suggestive the figure. He who falls into error or sin is thrown out of relation to everything about him. Now, most of these sins, the individual knows that they did. Sometimes they might not. But whether they know it or not, they're thrown out of relationship to everything, and they really need somebody to help them. He may realize his error and be filled with remorse, but he cannot recover himself. He is in confusion and perplexity, worsted and helpless. He is to be reclaimed, healed, re-established. So, that doesn't apply to everybody, I don't believe. I think many have been in God's work long enough that when they make a mistake, they know how to get back in harmony with God. But some are just like it describes here, and that may be the very one we're trying to help, and we increase their confusion, their perplexity. But what we're supposed to do is to help them get connected with God again, get connected with the rest of us again, and to not feel like a second-rate citizen in the church because of what they did, but to really be fully and completely restored to the position they had before. In a manuscript 8A, 1888, do not become impatient with your brother's faults and weaknesses. On another point, you may well be disgusted with your own weakness. So it's not always that we have the same fault they do, although you've heard of the illustration that when we point the finger, there's three fingers pointing back at us. And a lot of times what irritates us and other people is the same things that we do. That's true. But it isn't always that way. So, but always we have some weakness that's different from theirs, and we need to remember that as we try to help them with their weakness. Now, because of the way so many churches are on this point, the prophet had to do some work along this line, and she mentions it in the letter 67, 1905. I have frequently been instructed to have a special charge over some who were in danger through special temptations. There are many who have weak points of character. I am instructed that when they shall be overtaken in a fault and overcome, I am not to leave them to the unadvised words or unchristlike methods of those who have not the love and pity and grace of Christ in their hearts. So in other words, she had to go behind that other church member that was crushing somebody who had fallen, and to try to restore them the way God wants us to do. And so that was her ministry. She even had to do it with pastors. There were pastors that were mistreated by their superiors, and she had to go and try to help these situations. That was part of her ministry that God gave to her. There's a text, very well-known text in 1 Corinthians 10:12, that's a good counsel for each of us. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. So the very moment that we're trying to help somebody else, if we think that we can't fall, then we are fooling ourselves, because the very time when we think we are going to be able to stand and not be the one that's doing wrong, lo and behold, we find later that it was us as well. Going on to verse 2, he expands this a little more by saying, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now there's two directions to this. We've read about the one way that we bear the faults of each other, by talking to them and by praying. Of course, if it's something the whole church sees, we don't need everybody going to them. One person is enough. But that's the way we bear one another's burdens. We make sure that nobody loses their way, that everyone in this church stays on the path and goes forward in there. Excuse me, whenever I catch anything, even upper respiratory, it's a problem for a long time. Sorry, you have to put up with it. The other way of bearing one another's burdens is to not be troubled by the weaknesses of others. And that way we bear it. You know, sometimes you may think, this is too much to bear. But if they're here, then God plans us to bear it. In Signs of the Times of May 11, 1904, in our dealings with one another, we are to keep in constant exercise the principle of mutual forbearance and helpfulness. Basically, we're to think, if they can put up with me, I can put up with them. If we think that way, it makes it easy to react in the proper manner. Our sympathies are to go out to those around us. We are to be courteous and considerate to all. And in Review and Herald of August 14, 1888, we are exhorted to watch and see where we can build up one another in the most holy faith. Now, I like that one. This is a proactive one. In other words, we're always looking, is there something I can say to brother or sister so-and-so that will help them in their Christian walk? Is there some encouragement I can give them? Is there some piece of information that I have that I could share with them which will help them to be more sure of making heaven? That is really the fullness of the text that we're looking at. We are to help others on in the way of salvation. Never to be a stumbling block, never to be driving them away from salvation, but always helping them toward being able to be saved. And this was an interesting example that is given in Signs of the Times of December 10, 1885. We have read accounts of travelers climbing mountains, how careful they must be where they step. They must have a guide along the rugged and dangerous ascent. Of course, Jesus is our guide, lest they make a misstep and be lost. Sometimes in passing over very dangerous places, the whole party is bound together with ropes, so that if one should slip, the others would hold him until he could regain his footing. Isn't that a beautiful illustration of what we as church members are to do? We're to be like those climbers with a rope attached to all of us, so that if anybody slips and makes a mistake, that we are able to keep them from falling lower and giving up until they can get their footing again, and assist them in getting their footing again. That's our task. In a manuscript 65, 1903, I speak to church members. Be always ready gladly and cheerfully to serve one another. So this is really a dimension of the communion service. The foot washing service is basically the commitment time that we are always going to be glad, always cheerful, to be able to serve each other in some way that will keep them on the path to heaven. Now, Jesus gives us the instruction of how it's supposed to be. And we all know the one in Mark 12:31, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Our nearest neighbors are our fellow church members. Even though, we have other neighbors perhaps. But because we spend quite a bit of time together, our nearest neighbor is each other. And he said we are to love each other as we love ourselves. But Jesus takes that even a step higher by this one in John 13, verse 34. A new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. So unless we take the way Jesus loved us as our pattern, we're not going to reach the goal. But Paul is stressing the importance of reaching that goal, of the way we treat each other is that we love each other like Jesus loved us. Now, Paul also gives a warning in verse 3. He says, for if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. Now here's the underlying problem. If we go to correct somebody in a way that hurts them and discourages them, when we do that, we have done what it says don't do. Or if a man think himself to be something, that's what we just did. But the truth is, we are nothing. And we have deceived ourselves in our view of ourselves. So that also needs to be corrected, because otherwise they're not able to help each other in the right way. And that's explained a little more here in the Review and Herald of June 28, 1887. How many have altogether too high an opinion of their own ability, lifting up themselves, extolling self, while they censure and condemn their brethren, in the place of following the Bible rule in dealing with the erring. This is a sin that we want to make sure to take care of if we can see it. The problem is that one's a hard one to see. But the Lord in His love will bring it out somehow so we can see it. 6 Testimonies 398. If a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. But now, what does God do for that person? He himself is in constant danger. He who ignores the grave necessities of his brother will, in the providence of God, be brought over the same ground that his brother has traveled in trial and sorrow. And by a bitter experience, it will be proved to him that he is as helpless and needy as was the suffering one whom he repulsed. So, in God's plan, he has to let that person make another mistake of their own. He has to allow the same problems to confront them so that they fall in order to be able to help that person get straightened out. Well, that's usually pretty embarrassing and, very humiliating. It's better than not having it happen, but how much better it is to do it the way Paul said rather than to do it that way and end up having this happen to us. Here's one from a letter, 77, 1893. And I believe this is so true for today. This is not a time for brother to cherish prejudice against brother. We are at war. And it's becoming more and more certain every day that we are at war. It's the devil that we're fighting, not people. We can condemn people for what they're doing, and they shouldn't do some of those things, but what they don't know is that they've been guided by the devil, because the devil is trying to do what he's never been allowed to do. At the Tower of Babel, he tried to have a one world government. God said, no, you can't do it. Even in the flood, they were pretty close to one world government at that time. And then after that was the Tower of Babel. And then, of course, we know from Daniel 2 that the attempts would be continuous to try to unite the world. And according to Daniel 2, it will never happen. However, according to Revelation 17, it will happen for 1 hour. There will be a worldwide control. And so the devil is going to finally achieve what he has never been allowed to do by God. And that's why this is not a time for brother to cherish prejudice against brother. But we are to really work on working together, keeping strong, helping each other keep strong, so that we can remain true through what's ahead of us. Then we have verses 4 and 5. But let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. For every man shall bear his own burden. Now that one took a little study. What is the way that we can prove our own work so that we can have rejoicing? Signs of the Times of May 26, 1890. You have before you the example of Christ. So the idea I got from that is that by comparing the way we treat people with the way Jesus treated people, we can see whether our work is approved or not. And if we have any lack from the way Jesus handled people, then there's some growing yet to do. although the homage and service of all was his due, yet he sought not honor of men. He came not to be ministered unto, but to minister. So, basically it's saying he didn't come acting like he thought he was somebody. He was not looking for applause from anybody. He simply was handling people in the way heaven wants them to be handled. Here's another one I found in letter 196, 1901. Do you really believe, my brother, that should your life suddenly be cut off, your record in the books of heaven would be such that you would not be ashamed to look upon it? Now, of course, we may not know everything that's in the record books of heaven, but a lot of it we do know because we know what we did. And so another way to prove our work is to compare the record with what the record should be in the courts above. And if we don't find it's the record that we want, then God is calling for some changes again. And of course, his last phrase here is, he's basically reminding about the judgment. For every man shall bear his own burden. In other words, we will have to answer for the way that we treated people, unless, of course, they've been forgiven, which is always available. Anytime we mistreat somebody, it can always be forgiven by asking the person forgiveness and asking God, and then, of course, it will not be held against us at that time. The last verse, verse 6, let him that is taught in the word communicate, and this one I really had trouble with. I read a bunch of translations, and none of them seemed to really get it very clear. Let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. But when I looked up the root meaning of that word translated communicate, I found two things that were very helpful. One, be partaker. In other words, we are to be able to partake with each other without frustration or unhappiness. Also, another word is partner. We are all partners in this war against the devil. And so God is wanting us to recognize that we are partners. And it's talking about a particular part of the partnership. Let him that is taught, in other words, the one that's sitting in the Sabbath school class, the one that's sitting in the sermon, they are the ones being taught. And they're being taught the word. Then it goes on to say that the one that's being taught should communicate or be a partaker or a partner unto him that teacheth in all good things. This is especially talking about pastors, how that, the whole tithing system is based upon the fact that those who are taught by the word need to feel their responsibility to take care of the person that is teaching the word. Now, I'm thankful in our church we don't do it church by church. We turn our tithe into the conference, and the conference pays the pastors, because otherwise pastors of big churches would get big salaries, and pastors of small churches would get a small salary. But God has given us a good plan. And here's a comment on that from Southern Watchman, January 15, 1901. Let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. here is presented the responsibility resting on one to teach the word. So the responsibility on all those that stand up before the congregation, they have the responsibility not to teach their opinions, but to teach the word. Here is presented the responsibility resting on one to teach the word, and the equal responsibility resting on him who is taught, the hearer, the learner, to show respect and appreciation for those laboring in the ministry. So it goes beyond just to financially support those that are doing that. He is to feel his obligation to impart to them of his temporal subsistence in all good things. So it applies both ways here. The showing of respect, the showing of appreciation for those who teach the word, and also to support financially. Now, I've had some people from time to time want to give me their tithe. I'll tell you ahead of time I won't take it, so don't try to do that. We are well cared for financially. We don't need anything. But we do encourage the faithful tithe paying that will support those that are teaching the word. And don't get turned off because you know of some that are not teaching it as clearly as they should or as properly as they should. That's God's problem. That's not our problem. Our purpose is to be faithful in the giving of our tithes, and the Lord will take care of the rest. So may God help us with this good advice that was given to Paul, to have a church where we don't lose anybody and everybody feels loved. Even when they do wrong, they still feel loved. And, it does hurt sometimes to be talked to, but that's a temporary pain. And then we get past that and we go on closer together than ever before. So may that be our experience. And thank you, Margarita, for sharing the prelude to that this morning.